The morning sun painted the Arizona desert in shades of gold and red as Maria Santos stepped out of her small adobe house. The air was crisp and clean, carrying the scent of sage and dust that had become as familiar to her as breathing. She wrapped her worn shawl tighter around her shoulders and walked to the well behind her home. It's the same routine she had followed for 3 years now, 3 years since Diego died. The wooden bucket creaked as she lowered it into the well. Sound that echoed in the quiet morning. Maria had grown used to the silence. In fact, she preferred it now. The townspeople of Copper Creek had learned not to expect much conversation from the widow, who lived on the edge of their small community. They saw her as a woman broken by grief, someone who had retreated into herself after losing her husband in that terrible mining accident. If only they knew the truth. Maria pulled the bucket up, water sloshing gently inside. Her hands were calloused and strong, not soft like the hands of other women in town. These hands had held more than just cooking pots and sewing needles. They had held weapons. They had taken lives. But that was a lifetime ago. In a world that felt like a distant dream, she carried the water back to her house, passing the small vegetable garden that Diego had helped her plant in their first year of marriage. The tomatoes were coming along nicely, and the beans were already climbing their wooden stakes. Maria smiled slightly as she remembered how Diego used to joke that she could make anything grow in the harsh desert soil. "You have magic hands, mi amor," he would say, kissing her fingers. "Everything you touch becomes strong." Diego never knew about the real magic her hands possessed. The deadly magic that Swift Eagle had taught her so many years ago. Maria set the bucket down and gazed out at the horizon, where the desert stretched endlessly toward the mountains. Somewhere out there, beyond those peaks, lived the people who had raised her after her real parents died. The Chiricahua Apache had found her when she was just 8 years old, half dead from thirst and fear, wandering the desert after raiders had attacked her family's wagon. Most white children captured by Apache tribes never survived the harsh life, but Maria had been different. She had adapted quickly, learning their language, their ways, their customs. Swift Eagle, one of the tribe's most respected warriors, had taken her in as his own daughter. He saw something in her that others missed, a natural warrior's instinct, an ability to move silently and strike precisely. The blade is not just a weapon, Swift Eagle had taught her during those long training sessions in the desert. It is an extension of your spirit. When you hold it, you must become one with it. Maria shook her head, pushing the memories away. Those days were behind her now. She was just a simple widow trying to live a quiet life. She spent the morning tending to her garden and mending clothes. Around noon, she walked into town to buy supplies at Peterson's general store. The storekeeper, old Pete, nodded politely, but didn't try to make conversation. He had learned years ago that Maria Santos preferred to conduct her business quickly and quietly. "Good morning, Mrs. Santos," he said, weighing out the flowers she had requested. "Good morning," Maria replied softly, counting out the coins from her small purse. As she waited, she noticed a group of women near the fabric section, talking in hushed voices. They kept glancing in her direction, and Maria caught bits of their conversation. "Poor thing," one of them whispered. 3 years and she still barely speaks to anyone. I heard she doesn't even go to the church socials anymore," another added. "Tacan." "You blame her? Losing a husband so young? And the way it happened?" Maria pretended not to hear them. Let them think what they wanted. It was better this way. The less attention she drew to herself, the safer everyone would be. Because, despite her quiet life, despite the peaceful routine she had built, Maria knew that violence had a way of finding her. It always had. She completed her purchases and walked home, taking the long way around town. The path led past the old cemetery where Diego was buried. Maria stopped at his grave, placing a small wildflower on the weathered wooden cross that marked his resting place. "Another quiet day, mi amor," she whispered. "Just the way you would have wanted it." Diego had been such a gentle man, so different from the warriors she had known in her youth. He worked hard at the copper mine, came home tired but happy, and never asked questions about her past. He had accepted her stories about growing up in a Mexican orphanage, never pushing for details when she became vague or changed the subject. On their wedding day, Diego had given her a small silver locket with their picture inside. Maria still wore it every day, hidden beneath her simple dress. But what Diego didn't know was that she also wore something else, a thin leather cord around her waist, almost invisible under her clothes. Attached to it was a small, perfectly balanced throwing knife that Swift Eagle had made for her before. She left the tribe. "Always be prepared, little warrior," he had told her. "Peace is precious, but it can be taken away in a moment." Maria walked back to her house as the afternoon heat began to build. She had learned to time her activities around the desert sun, another skill from her Apache upbringing. The townspeople thought she was just a smart desert dweller, but really, she was following lessons learned during countless hunting trips and raids. Inside her cool adobe house, Maria began preparing her simple evening meal, rice and beans, with some vegetables from her garden. As she cooked, she listened to the sounds around her, the wind through the mesquite trees, the distant call of a hawk, the occasional rumble of a wagon on the main road. Her hearing was exceptionally sharp, trained by years of needing to detect danger before it arrived. In the Apache camps, survival had depended on such skills. Children learned early to identify the difference between the footstep of a friend and the footstep of an enemy, between the natural sounds of the desert and the sounds that meant trouble. Even now, in her peaceful kitchen, Maria's senses remained alert. It was a habit she couldn't break, and perhaps didn't want to. The skills that Swift Eagle had taught her were part of who she was, even if she'd never planned to use them again. As darkness fell, Maria lit a single candle and sat by her window with her sewing. To anyone watching, she looked like any other widow spending a quiet evening alone. But her eyes constantly scanned the desert around her house. Her ears picked up every sound that didn't belong. She had chosen this house specifically because it sat slightly apart from the main town. With clear views in all directions, the placement wasn't accidental, it was strategic. Old habits from a warrior's training that she couldn't completely abandon. Maria finished her sewing and prepared for bed. Following the same routine she had maintained for 3 years, she checked the doors and windows, not just to lock them, but to ensure they would make noise if opened. She placed her water pitcher in a specific spot where anyone entering would likely bump into it in the darkness. Before sleeping, she knelt beside her bed and said a prayer for Diego's soul, as she did every night. But tonight, for reasons she couldn't explain, she also found herself thinking about Swift Eagle and wondering if he was still alive. Still training young warriors in the ways of the blade, the desert wind whispered through the walls of her house, carrying with it the scent of distant storms. Maria pulled her thin blanket up to her chin and closed her eyes, not knowing that her peaceful life was about to change forever, not knowing that tomorrow would bring strangers to Copper Creek, dangerous men who would see her quiet existence as a sign of weakness rather than strength. For now, she slept the light sleep of a warrior, even in peace, ready for war. The dust cloud appeared on the horizon just after noon, growing larger as it approached Copper Creek. Maria noticed it first from her garden, where she was picking tomatoes for her lunch. Living on the edge of town meant she saw travelers before anyone else did, and something about this group made her pause. 5 riders, moving at a steady pace, but not in any hurry. Their horses looked tired, and even from a distance, Maria could tell these weren't ordinary travelers. The way they sat in their saddles, the way they spread out slightly as they approached the town. These were men who expected trouble and were ready for it. Maria set down her basket of tomatoes and walked to the side of her house where she could get a better view. The riders had stopped at the edge of town, and she could see them talking among themselves, pointing at different buildings. One of them, a tall man with a dark hat, seemed to be giving orders to the others. In town, she could hear the normal sounds of daily life beginning to change. Conversations were getting quieter, doors were closing. The people of Copper Creek had learned to recognize danger when it rode into their peaceful community. Maria went back inside her house and continued with her daily routine, but she kept watching through her window. The riders had split up now, to heading toward the saloon, toward the general store, and the tall one riding slowly down the main street, looking at each building carefully. By evening, the whole town was talking about the strangers. Maria learned what she needed to know during her usual trip to the well, where Mrs. Rodriguez from the house next door was also drawing water. "They're asking questions about everyone," Mrs. Rodriguez whispered, glancing around nervously, "especially about who has money, who lives alone, that sort of thing." "What kind of questions?" Maria asked quietly. "About the miners, about anyone who might have savings hidden away. And they're drinking heavily at the saloon, getting louder and more aggressive as the night goes on." Maria nodded and returned to her house, but she didn't sleep well that night. Through her thin walls, she could hear the sounds from town, loud voices, laughter that didn't sound friendly, and the occasional crash of something being knocked over. These weren't travelers passing through. These were predators who had found what they thought was easy prey. The next morning brought confirmation of her fears. Old Pete's store had been robbed during the night. The strangers had taken money from the cash box and helped themselves to supplies, leaving Pete tied up in his own stockroom. When the sheriff tried to confront them, they laughed in his face and made it clear they were planning to stay as long as they wanted. "What can I do?" Sheriff Thompson told the small crowd that had gathered outside his office. "There's 5 of them, all armed, and they haven't technically broken any major laws yet." "The store robbery. Well, Pete says he can't be sure it was." Them, Maria knew Pete was lying to protect himself and his family. She had seen the fear in his eyes when she went to buy flour that morning. The strangers had made their message clear: cooperate or face worse consequences. That afternoon, she got her first close look at the gang's leader. He came riding slowly past her house, taking his time to look at her property. Maria was hanging laundry on the line behind her house when she heard the horse approaching. She continued with her work, but kept the rider in the corner of her vision. He was younger than she had expected. Maybe 30 years old, with cold blue eyes and a face that might have been handsome, if not for the cruel set of his mouth. His clothes were dusty from travel, but his gun belt was well maintained, and his weapons looked expensive. "Good afternoon, ma'am," he called out, tipping his hat with exaggerated politeness. Maria nodded but didn't reply, continuing to hang Diego's old work shirt on the line. "Fine day, isn't it?" the man continued. "Name's Colt Brennan." "I don't believe. We've been introduced." "Maria Santos," she replied simply, not looking directly at him. "Santos, ... That was your husband's name, wasn't it? Heard he worked the copper mine before he died. Terrible accident, from what I understand." Maria's hand stilled on the clothesline. This man had been asking questions about her specifically. "Yes," she said quietly. "Must be hard, living out here all alone. A woman by herself, no protection, no one to help, if trouble comes calling." Brennan's voice carried a subtle threat that made Maria's skin crawl. "I manage," she replied, finally turning to look at him directly. For a moment, her eyes met, and Maria saw something flicker across Brennan's face. Surprise, maybe, or confusion. Most people, especially women, looked away when he stared at them like that. But Maria held his gaze steadily, her dark eyes revealing nothing of what she was thinking. "I'm sure you do," Brennan said slowly. "But managing and thriving are 2 different things. A woman like you shouldn't have to scrape by on what little. A dead miner left behind. My husband left me everything I need." Brennan smiled, but it wasn't a pleasant expression. "Did he now? That's interesting. Very interesting." He touched his hat again. "I'll be seeing you around, Mrs. Santos. This is a small town after all." He rode away, but Maria knew this wasn't the end of it. She finished hanging the laundry with hands that remained perfectly steady, but inside. Her warrior instincts were fully awake for the first time in 3 years. That evening, she heard more stories from the frightened townspeople. The gang had taken over the saloon, forcing the owner to serve them free drinks. They had demanded protection money from several businesses, and they had been asking very specific questions about Maria Santos and her dead husband's supposed hidden savings. "They think Diego struck it rich before he died," Mrs. Rodriguez told her in a worried whisper. "They think you're hiding money out here." Maria almost laughed. Diego had been a good man and a hard worker, but he had never found any significant or deposits. They had lived modestly on his wages, saving what little they could. The gang was chasing shadows, but dangerous shadows that could get people hurt. Over the next 2 days, Brennan made it a point to ride past her house at least once each day. Sometimes he would stop and make conversation, always polite on the surface, but with that underlying threat growing stronger each time. Mrs. Santos, he said during one of these visits, my boys and I were thinking this area might be a good place to set up camp for a while. Peaceful, quiet, plenty of space to spread out. There are better places closer to water, Maria replied, continuing to tend her garden. Maybe, but we like the privacy out here and the company. His eyes lingered on her in a way that made her skin crawl. A woman gets lonely, I imagine. Might appreciate some male companionship around the place. Maria straightened up, meeting his gaze directly. I prefer my privacy. Now, that's not very neighborly, Brennan said, his smile turning cold, especially when we're being so polite about asking. The threat was clear now. They weren't just after money, they wanted her property as a base of operations, and they had decided she was too weak to stop them. A lone widow with no protection, no family, no one who would seriously fight for her. That night, Maria sat by her window long after dark, watching the desert around her house. The gang had been drinking heavily again, and their voices carried clearly across the desert air. They were planning something, and she knew it involved her. For the first time in 3 years, Maria went to the wooden chest at the foot of her bed and opened it. Beneath Diego's old clothes and their wedding photos wrapped in oiled leather were the gifts Swift Eagle had given her before she left the Apache. 5 perfectly balanced throwing knives, each one forged by the old warrior himself. And beneath them, a curved fighting blade with a handle worn smooth by years of practice. Maria lifted one of the throwing knives, testing its weight. The balance was still perfect, the edge still sharp. Swift Eagle had taught her to maintain her weapons, even if she never planned to use them. A warrior's tools are like a warrior's skills, he had told her. They must be ready when needed, or they are worthless when the moment comes. She rewrapped the weapons and put them back in the chest, but she didn't lock it. Tomorrow, she knew, the games would end. Brennan and his men would make their move, expecting to find a helpless woman they could intimidate and control. Instead, they would find something far more dangerous than they could imagine. Maria Santos had lived peacefully for 3 years, but she had never stopped being Swift Eagle's daughter. And tomorrow, they would learn the difference between a woman who couldn't fight back and a woman who chose not to. The desert wind whispered through her house as Maria finally went to bed, but she slept lightly, every sense alert for the sound of approaching horses. The quiet life she had built was about to end, and the warrior she had buried was about to rise again. The attack came on the 3rd night, just as Maria had expected. She was sitting by her window, pretending to read her old prayer book by candlelight, when she heard the horses approaching. 5 riders moving slowly and quietly, trying not to alert the town. They thought they were being clever. But Maria had been listening to their conversations carry across the desert air for hours. Remember, we want her alive, she had heard Brennan tell his men earlier. She's going to tell us where the money is hidden, and then we're going to make this place our home base. Maria blew out her candle and moved away from the window. The darkness, she could hear them dismounting, their boots crunching softly on the gravelly ground around her house. They were trying to be quiet, but 2 ears trained in Apache stealth techniques. They sounded like a herd of cattle. She made her way to her bedroom, moving silently through the familiar layout of her home. Behind her, she could hear them whispering to each other as they positioned themselves around the house. They had probably done this many times before, surrounding isolated homes, trapping their victims inside, taking whatever they wanted. Tonight would be different. Maria knelt beside her wooden chest and opened it with hands that were perfectly steady. The oiled leather wrapping fell away, revealing the weapons Swift Eagle had crafted for her so many years ago. As her fingers closed around the familiar handles, something inside her shifted. The quiet widow named Maria Santos began to fade away, replaced by someone else entirely. "Little warrior," she whispered, using the name Swift Eagle had called her. "It's time to wake up." The throwing knives felt like extensions of her own fingers as she slipped them into the special belt she had kept hidden all these years. The curved fighting blade went into a sheath at her back, concealed beneath her dark shawl. To anyone watching, she would still look like a frightened woman in a niche. TGOWN. That was exactly what she wanted. The first sound came from her front door, a gentle creaking as someone tested the latch. Maria had left it unlocked on purpose. She positioned herself in the corner of her bedroom, where the shadows were deepest. Becoming one with the darkness, just as Swift Eagle had taught her. Doors open, she heard one of them whisper, "She wouldn't be expecting us." Footsteps entered her house, heavy and confident. They weren't even trying to be quiet now. Maria counted at least 3 sets of boots, which meant 2 were probably watching the back of the house in case she tried to run. "Mrs. Santos," Brennan's voice called out, falsely cheerful. "No need to hide. We just want to have a little conversation." "About your late husband's savings?" Maria remained perfectly still, controlling her breathing just as she had been taught during those long training sessions in the Apache camps. Her heart rate slowed, her senses sharpened, and the familiar calm of the warrior settled over her like a comfortable blanket. "Check the bedroom," Brennan ordered, "and be gentle with her." For now, the first man to enter her bedroom never saw her coming. He stepped through the doorway, his attention focused on the empty bed, and Maria moved like a shadow. The throwing knife caught him in the throat before he could make a sound, and he dropped silently to the floor. "Rodriguez, what's taking so long?" Brennan called from the main room. Maria was already moving, ghosting along the wall toward the doorway. The second man entered cautiously, his gun drawn, but he was looking toward the bed just like his partner. Had Maria's blade found the spot between his ribs that Swift Eagle had shown her? The place where a knife could reach the heart without hitting bone? He managed half a gasp before collapsing beside his companion. "Rodriguez. Tommy." Brennan's voice was sharper now, tinged with concern. Maria heard him moving toward the bedroom, where she was already gone, slipping through the back door that she had left slightly ajar. The 2 men watching the rear of the house were positioned, exactly where she had expected them to be, one on each side of her small garden. The first one never knew what hit him. Maria approached from behind, moving with the fluid grace of a hunting cat. Her knife found its mark between his shoulder blades, angled upward just as Swift Eagle had taught her. He pitched forward into the tomato plants without a sound. Second guard heard the disturbance and turned toward the garden, but Maria was already moving. She came at him from the side, staying low, and her blade opened his throat before he could cry out a warning. For down. 1 to go. Maria circled back toward the front of her house, where she could hear Brennan calling for his men. His voice was getting more worried by the minute, but he still hadn't figured out what was happening. In his experience, lone women didn't fight back. They certainly didn't fight back successfully. "Boys, if this is some kind of joke, it ain't funny," Brennan shouted. "Get out here right now." Maria positioned herself beside the front door, pressing her back against the adobe wall. She could hear Brennan moving around inside, probably checking the bedroom and finding his dead companions. When he emerged, he would be angry and confused, which would make him careless. The door burst open and Brennan stumbled out, his gun drawn, spinning wildly as he tried to spot his missing men. Maria waited until he was completely clear of the doorway before she moved. "Looking for your friends?" she asked quietly. Brennan spun toward her voice, but Maria was already moving again, staying in the shadows. The moonlight worked in her favor, keeping her dark clothing and olive skin nearly invisible, while illuminating his pale face and light-colored shirt. "Where are my men?" he demanded, pointing his gun in her general direction, but unable to get a clear shot. "Dead," Maria replied simply, her voice coming from a different direction now. Brennan fired blindly toward the sound, but Maria was already somewhere else. Swift Eagle had taught her that in darkness, sound was both weapon and weakness. Let your enemy hear you where you want to be heard, but never where you actually are. "You're lying," Brennan snarled. "You're just a woman. You can't have." His words trailed off as he caught sight of Tommy's body in the garden, illuminated by the moonlight. The reality of the situation was finally sinking in. The helpless widow. He had been planning to intimidate, and rob was something else entirely. "What are you?" he whispered. Maria stepped into the moonlight, where he could see her clearly. The throwing knife in her hand caught the silver light, and for the first time in 3 years, she allowed her true nature to show in her eyes. The gentle widow was gone, replaced by something far more dangerous. "I am Swift Eagle's daughter," she said in a voice that carried the authority of a warrior. "And you made a very serious mistake." Brennan raised his gun, but his hands were shaking. Now he had seen the bodies of his men, had witnessed what this woman was capable of, and fear was making him clumsy. "You're some kind of witch," he stammered. "This ain't natural." "No," Maria replied, beginning to circle him slowly. "It's very natural. You came here planning to hurt an innocent woman. You threatened my home, my peace, my life. What did you think would happen?" Brennan tried to keep his gun trained on her, but Maria was moving like smoke, never staying in one place long enough for him to get a clear shot. This was another lesson from Swift Eagle. In close combat, constant movement was life, and stillness was death. "I'll leave," Brennan said desperately. "I'll take my men and go. We'll never bother you again." "Your men are dead," Maria reminded him, "and you're not leaving." She could see the exact moment when Brennan realized he was going to die. His face went pale, and he started backing toward his horse. But Maria was faster, and she knew this ground better than he did. Every rock, every bush, every shadow was familiar to her. The throwing knife left her hand with perfect accuracy, striking Brennan in the shoulder and spinning him around. His gun went flying, clattering away into the darkness. He fell to his knees, clutching his wounded shoulder, and looked up at Maria with terror in his eyes. "Please," he whispered. "I was just trying to make a living." Maria stood over him, another knife already in her hand. By hurting innocent people, by threatening women who couldn't protect themselves. She paused, thinking of all the other communities. This gang had probably terrorized. How many others have you done this to? Brennan didn't answer, but the guilt in his eyes told her everything she needed to know. "I should kill you," Maria said quietly. "It would be justice." "But you won't," Brennan said, hope creeping into his voice. "You're not a killer. You're just a woman who got lucky." Maria smiled, and it was not a pleasant expression. "I'm not going to kill you because death would be too easy. You're going to live, but you're going to remember this night for the rest of your life. You're going to remember that you underestimated a woman, and it cost you everything." She pulled the knife from his shoulder, ignoring his scream of pain. Then she hauled him to his feet and began marching him toward town, where Sheriff Thompson would be very interested to hear about the gang that had been terrorizing his community as they walked. Maria felt the warrior spirit that had awakened in her beginning to settle back into its long sleep. The immediate threat was over, and she could return to her quiet life, but she would never again be the same helpless widow that Brennan had tried to victimize. Swift Eagle's daughter had awakened. She would always be ready when needed. Dawn was breaking over Copper Creek when Maria walked into town, pushing the wounded Brennan ahead of her. The early morning light revealed the full extent of what had happened during the night, and the townspeople who saw them could hardly believe their eyes. The quiet widow they barely knew was marching the gang leader down Main Street like a prisoner of war. Brennan's shoulder was bandaged with strips torn from Maria's own shawl, but his face was pale with pain and shock. More shocking still was the change in Maria herself. She moved with a confidence and authority that none of them had ever seen before. Sheriff Thompson came running from his office, still pulling on his boots. "Mrs. Santos, what in heaven's name happened?" "This man and his gang attacked my home," Maria said simply. "The others are dead. This one lives to face justice." Sheriff's jaw dropped. He looked from Maria to the infamous Brennan, trying to process what he was seeing. You killed 4 armed men? By yourself?" "They made the choice to come to my home with violence," Maria replied. "I simply responded in kind." Word spread quickly through the small town. People emerged from their houses and businesses, gathering around to stare at the woman who had done what their sheriff and all the men in town had been afraid to attempt. Mrs. Rodriguez crossed herself and whispered prayers in Spanish. Old Pete from the general store just shook his head in amazement, but Maria's attention was focused elsewhere. As she handed Brennan over to the sheriff, she noticed something that made her blood run cold. Fresh horse tracks in the dust, leading away from town toward the east. Tracks that were only a few hours old. "Sheriff," she said quietly, pulling him aside. "Many men were in this gang when they first arrived?" Thompson thought for a moment. "5, like you said." "Why?" Maria pointed to the tracks. "Those aren't from last night. Someone else was here this morning, early, and left in a hurry." The sheriff's face went pale as he understood the implications. "You think Brennan had more? Men? Men who weren't with him last night?" "Or men who were supposed to meet him here," Maria said grimly. "Either way, they know their leader is captured and their gang is dead. They'll be looking for revenge." Brennan, despite his pain, started laughing. It was an ugly sound that made. Everyone in the crowd stepped back. "You think it's over?" he wheezed. "You think killing 4 men ends this?" "What's he talking about?" Thompson demanded. Brennan's smile was filled with malice. "My brother Jake is out there somewhere with 3 more men. When he finds out what happened here, he's going to burn this whole town to the ground. And you lady, you're going to wish you'd never been born." Maria felt her stomach drop. She had assumed the 5 men were the entire gang, but if there were more, the people of Copper Creek were in terrible danger, and it was her fault for not getting more information before acting. "Where are they?" she asked Brennan sharply. "Wouldn't you like to know?" he sneered. "Could be anywhere by now. Could be watching us right now, planning their next move." Thompson looked around nervously. "Mrs. Santos, if there are more of them out there, then I'll deal with them too," Maria said firmly. But inside she was already planning for more men, led by someone who would be even more dangerous than Brennan because he would be motivated by revenge. And unlike last night, she wouldn't have the advantage of fighting on her own ground. She spent the rest of the morning gathering information. The townspeople, now that they knew she was trying to protect them, were eager to help. Several people had seen the mysterious riders who had left town before dawn. They had been asking questions about supplies and water sources, apparently planning to wait in the desert until Brennan's group finished their business in town. They were asking about the old mining camps, Mrs. Rodriguez told her. The abandoned ones up in the hills where there's still water from the old wells. Maria nodded. That made sense. The abandoned mining camps would provide shelter and water while keeping them close enough to town to strike when they were ready. But there were at least a dozen such camps scattered throughout the hills around Copper Creek. "I'm coming with you," Sheriff Thompson announced, when he realized what Maria was planning. "No," Maria said simply. "You're needed here to protect the town. If I fail, you'll be their last line of defense. But you can't go alone against 4 armed men." Maria looked at him with those dark eyes that had seen so much more than anyone realized. "Sheriff, I appreciate your concern, but this is what I was trained for." She spent the afternoon preparing for what might be her final hunt. From her house, she gathered supplies, water, dried food, and most importantly, her remaining weapons. The curved fighting blade went across her back, hidden beneath a long coat. The throwing knives were distributed in various concealed sheaths around her body as the sun began to set. Maria mounted Diego's old horse and rode out of town toward the hills. Behind her, the people of Copper Creek watched her go with a mixture of hope and fear. Some of them were already packing their belongings, ready to flee if she didn't return. The first abandoned mining camp was empty, showing no signs of recent occupation. Maria approached it carefully, using skills Swift Eagle had taught her for scouting enemy positions. She checked for tracks, disturbed vegetation, signs of cooking fires, anything that might indicate human presence. The second camp was also empty, but here she found something interesting. Fresh horse droppings, not more than a day old. They had been here, but they had moved on. Maria studied the tracks leading away from the camp, reading the story they told. For horses, moving at a steady pace toward the higher elevations. As night fell, Maria continued her hunt by moonlight. This was dangerous terrain, rocky and unforgiving, but she had learned to navigate such landscapes during her years with the Apache. Every shadow, every sound, every change in the wind carried information for those who knew how to read it. At the third camp, she struck gold. The smell of smoke lingered in the air, too fresh to be from old campfires. Somewhere nearby, men were trying to stay warm against the desert night. Maria dismounted and left her horse tied to a mesquite bush, then approached on foot. The camp was built around an old mine shaft, with several wooden buildings that had partially collapsed over the years. It's a perfect cover for men who wanted to stay hidden while they planned their revenge. Maria could see the faint glow of a fire through the cracks in one of the buildings. She circled the camp carefully, counting the horses tied near the old mining equipment. For horses, just as she had expected. That meant all of Brennan's remaining men were here, probably planning their attack on Copper Creek for tomorrow morning. Maria found a position on higher ground where she could observe the camp without being seen through a gap in the wooden walls. She could see 3 men sitting around a small fire. They were passing a bottle between them and talking in low, angry voices. "Jake's been gone too long," one of them was saying. "Should have been back hours ago." "Maybe they decided to have some fun with that widow before finishing the job," another replied with an ugly laugh. "Or maybe something went wrong," the third man said nervously. "We should have heard something by now." Maria smiled grimly. Jake must be the 4th man, probably scouting the town or trying to make contact with his captured brother. She only had to deal with 3 men here, with a 4th somewhere else. She waited patiently, just as Swift Eagle had taught her. A warrior's greatest weapon is patience, the old Apache had always said. Strike too soon, and you lose the advantage. Wait for the perfect moment, and victory is assured. The perfect moment came an hour later, when 2 of the men decided to get more sleep, while the 3rd kept watch. The guard settled himself outside the building with his rifle across his knees. He was trying to stay alert, but obviously tired from their long ride. Maria moved like a ghost through the rocks and brush, getting closer to her target. When she was within throwing distance, she drew one of her knives and took careful aim. The blade flew true, striking the guard in the chest before he could make a sound. 2 down. 2 to go. She approached the building where the other men were sleeping. But as she reached for the door, she heard the sound of approaching horses. Jake was returning, and he wasn't alone. Maria counted at least 2 additional riders with him. Her heart sank. Instead of 4 men, she was now facing 5, possibly 6. And they would be alert and dangerous, especially once they found their dead companion. Maria retreated to her observation position and watched as Jake and his reinforcements rode into camp. Jake was an older, harder version of his brother Brennan. With scars on his face and hands that spoke of a lifetime of violence, the 2 men with him looked equally dangerous. "Where's Rodriguez?" Jake called out as he dismounted. When there was no answer, he began looking around the camp more carefully. It didn't take him long to find the dead guard, and when he did, his roar of rage echoed through the hills. "We're being hunted," he shouted to his men. "Someone killed Rodriguez. Everyone stay alert." Maria knew her advantage was gone. Now she was facing 5 fully alert, well-armed men who knew she was out there somewhere. The smart thing to do would be to retreat, return to town, try to organize a proper defense. But Maria also knew that if these men reached Copper Creek, innocent people would die. The moon was high in the desert sky when Maria began her final approach to the mining camp. 5 armed men were now spread throughout the old buildings, all of them alert and searching for the ghost who had killed their companion. Jake had positioned them well, one watching each direction, or himself in the center where he could coordinate their movements. Maria studied their positions from her hiding place among the rocks. These weren't the same kind of careless criminals who had attacked her house. Jake and his reinforcements were experienced fighters who knew how to work as a team. But they had one major weakness that Maria could exploit. They didn't know this terrain like she did. She had spent countless hours in these hills during her early years with Diego, exploring the old mining tunnels and learning every path through the rocky landscape. The Apache had taught her that knowledge of the ground was often more valuable than superior numbers or weapons, moving silently through the shadows. Maria made her way to the old mine shaft that dominated the center of the camp. The wooden support beams were rotted and dangerous, but she knew from previous explorations that there was a narrow ledge inside the shaft that could support her weight. Climbing down into the darkness, Maria positioned herself where she could hear the conversations happening above. Jake was giving orders to his men, his voice tight with anger and frustration. "She's out there watching us," he was saying. "Probably thinks she's real clever, picking us off one by one like she did Rodriguez. But we ain't my brother's men. We know how to handle a situation like this. What if we just leave?" One of his companions suggested, "Head to the next territory, find easier targets." "No." Jake's voice cracked like a whip. "Nobody kills my brothers. Menin gets away with it. Nobody humiliates the Brennan family and lives to tell about it. We're going to find this woman, and we're going to make her pay." Maria smiled grimly in the darkness. Jake's anger was making him predictable, just as Swift Eagle had taught her it would. An angry enemy is a defeated enemy, the old warrior had always said. Rage makes men stupid, and stupid men make mistakes. She climbed back up to the surface and began the most dangerous part of her plan. Moving from building to building, Maria used every shadow and piece of cover to get closer to Jake's men. The first target was a nervous young man who kept checking over his shoulder every few seconds. Maria approached him from his blind spot, moving with the fluid grace that years of Apache training had burned into her muscles. The throwing knife took him in the back before he could turn around, and he dropped silently behind a pile of old mining equipment. "Henderson, report," Jake called out a few minutes later. When there was no answer, Jake's voice got sharper. "Henderson, me." Maria was already moving to her next target, a grizzled older man who was supposed to be watching the south approach to the camp. He was good at his job, scanning the desert methodically, but he was looking for movement in the distance. He never thought to check directly above him. Maria had climbed onto the roof of the old assay office, using handholds in the weathered wood that were invisible from the ground. When the guard passed beneath her position, she dropped down behind him like a hunting cat. Her blade found its mark before he could cry out. "Two down," Maria whispered to herself. 3 to go." Jake was getting frantic now, calling out 2 men who would never answer. "Wilson? Henderson? What's happening out there?" The remaining 2 men were drawing closer to Jake's position, abandoning their posts to group together for mutual protection. This was exactly what Maria had hoped for. Fear was making them cluster together, which would make her final assault easier. But as she prepared to move against them, Maria heard something that made her blood run cold. The sound of horses approaching. From the direction of town, multiple horses, moving fast through the night. "Jake," a voice called out from the darkness. "Jake, where are you?" Maria's heart sank as she recognized the voice. It was Brennan himself, and he had somehow escaped from the jail in Copper Creek. She counted at least 4 riders with him, which meant he had managed to recruit even more men to his cause. Jake emerged from his hiding place, relief and excitement clear in his voice. "Colt, how did you get away?" "That fool sheriff thought one deputy could guard me overnight," Brennan replied as he dismounted. "I convinced him otherwise." "Where are your men?" "Dead," Jake said grimly. "We're being hunted by that woman from town. She's already killed 3 of mine, plus the 4 you lost last night." Brennan's face twisted with rage. "Where is she?" "Close," Jake said, scanning the shadows around the camp. "Real close. She's been picking us off one by one, moving through these old buildings like some kind of ghost." Maria found herself in a terrible situation. Instead of 5 enemies, she now faced 8 armed men, all of them alert and angry. Even worse, Brennan's escape meant that Sheriff Thompson and the townspeople were in immediate danger. If she failed here, nothing would stop this expanded gang from taking their revenge on Copper Creek. From her hiding place, she could hear Brennan organizing his men with the efficiency of someone who had done this many times before, spread out in pairs. He was saying, "Check every building, every hiding place. She's just one woman, no matter how lucky she's been so far." Maria knew she had to act quickly before they could organize a proper search. But 8 against 1 were impossible odds, even for someone with her training. She needed to change the Situations somehow create chaos that would give her an advantage. Looking around the old mining camp, Maria's eyes fell on something that gave her an idea. Near the main shaft, there were several barrels of old mining explosives that the previous owners had abandoned when the mine played out. The barrels were probably dangerous after sitting in the desert heat for years, but that danger might be exactly what she needed. Moving carefully through the shadows, Maria made her way to the explosives. The barrels were heavy and unstable, but she managed to position them near the main support beam of the old mining structure. If she could create enough of a distraction, she used her flint and steel to light a piece of cloth torn from her shirt, then touched it to the fuse of the nearest barrel. The fuse sparked to life. Giving her maybe 30 seconds before the explosion, Maria ran toward the edge of the camp, putting as much distance as possible between herself and the coming blast. Behind her, she could hear Brennan's men spreading out, getting closer to her former hiding place. The explosion, when it came, lit up the night sky like a miniature sunrise. The old mining structure collapsed in a roar of splintering wood and falling rock, sending debris flying in all directions. The sound echoed through the hills like thunder, and Maria could hear men shouting and cursing as they dove for cover. In the chaos that followed, Maria struck. Using the confusion and the clouds of dust that filled the air, she moved through the camp like the ghost Jake had called her. Her throwing knives found their targets with deadly accuracy, taking down 2 of Brennan's men before they even realized what was happening. But Brennan himself was too experienced to panic. Even as his men scattered and died around him, he kept his head and began moving toward the sound of Maria's attacks. When she turned to face him, she found herself looking down the barrel of his gun. "There you are," he said, with grim satisfaction. "The mysterious widow who thinks she's some kind of warrior." Maria stood perfectly still, her hands visible and empty. "Your men are dead, Brennan. It's over." "Not yet, it isn't," Brennan replied. "You've caused me a lot of trouble, lady. Killed my men, ruined my plans, cost me money and reputation." "But it ends here, does it?" Maria asked quietly. Brennan frowned, something in her tone making him cautious. "What's that supposed to mean?" Instead of answering, Maria smiled. It was the same expression that had terrified Brennan during their first confrontation at her house. The smile of a predator who had been underestimated once too often. "It means," Maria said, "that you're not the only one who brought reinforcements." The sound of horses approaching from multiple directions filled the night air. Sheriff Thompson's voice rang out across the desert, backed by what sounded like, "Half the men in Copper Creek? This is the law. Throw down your weapons." Brennan's face went pale as he realized he was surrounded. In his desperation to escape jail and get revenge, he had led his remaining men into a trap. Maria had counted on his anger making him predictable, and she had been right. "How?" Brennan whispered. "I sent a signal before I attacked your camp," Maria explained. "The explosion was meant to tell the sheriff where to find us. See, Brennan? I learned something important during my years with the Apache. Sometimes the best way to win a fight is to make sure you're not fighting alone." Brennan looked around wildly, but there was nowhere to run. The townsmen had surrounded the camp completely, and his remaining men were already throwing down their weapons and raising their hands. Slowly, Brennan lowered his gun. The fight had gone out of him as completely as air from a punctured balloon. "Who are you?" he asked one final time. Maria walked over and picked up his weapon, then looked him directly in the eyes. "I'm Maria Santos, widow of Diego Santos, resident of Copper Creek. I'm also the adopted daughter of Swift Eagle, war chief of the Chiricahua Apache. And I'm the woman who's going to make sure you never threaten innocent people again."